Hello, U.S. History students, and welcome to our discussion on the Washington and Adams administrations. When the Constitution's finally ratified in 1789, George Washington is unanimously elected the first president. And he reluctantly accepts this nomination because he's been a military leader for several years since the French and Indian War. He's the leader of the Continental Army during the Revolution. He gets a little bit of time back at Mount Vernon, and then he's elected president. And it's his leadership style that helps shape the new nation, as well as creates precedents or guidelines or standards by which future presidents and leaders will follow.
Public service, however dangerous to my reputation or disproportionate to my talents, it would have been inconsistent to have adopted a different maxim of conduct at this time. And yet, I feel a great difficulty as to how to act. I am vice president, yes, and in this I am nothing. But I may be everything. Well, General, you are here.
I am. Mr. Adams.
Yes, we are ready to administer the oath of office, sir.
I am at your service.
General, if you will please place your left hand on the Bible and raise your right hand. Repeat after me. I, George Washington, do solemnly swear.
I, George Washington, do solemnly swear
That I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
I will faithfully execute of the United States.
And will, to the best of my ability,
To the best of my ability.
preserve, protect, and defend
Preserve, protect, and defend
the Constitution of the United States.
the Constitution of the United States. So help me, God.
It is done. God bless George Washington, President of the United States.
So during his first term in office, Washington focuses on domestic issues or issues that are within the new nation. And he feels as though this needs to be done because it's going to help shape the new nation as well as kind of fix some issues that he sees. And one of the main things that he does is he passes the Judiciary Act of 1789, which creates the federal court system. Now, as we know, the Constitution does support the Supreme Court, which is the supreme law of the land, the Supreme Court of the land. But it doesn't actually give any guidelines for lower courts. Washington feels like this is necessary because the Supreme Court should not handle every single court case that comes to play. So under the Judiciary Act, he creates all of the lower court systems. So the appellate courts, the trial courts, the federal courts, and then anything else that's outside of the judicial branch, so that a case goes through multiple different courts before it actually reaches the Supreme Court. Congress also does not set any guidelines for a presidential cabinet, but Washington has the foresight to understand that one man cannot do it by himself. One man cannot be all the things to all the people. And so he decides he needs people that are more well-versed in different aspects of the types of government or the types of things the government will need that can help him out. And so he creates his cabinet or his series of advisors. And within this cabinet, he creates the Treasury, the State, the War, and the Justice Departments. And in these cabinet posts, he's got to have people to head those departments. And so the first person he chooses is Henry Knox. And Knox had been an advisor to him during the war. He's a Revolutionary War hero. He had been on many campaigns with Washington throughout that time frame. And so Washington feels as though he has the military knowledge to serve as Secretary of War. And then on his way from Mount Vernon, which is his home in Virginia, up to New York, which was the capital at the time, he stops off in Philadelphia and he speaks with Robert Morris, who had been the financier of the war, who really helped to make sure that there was funding to fight the war. And he's talking with Morris and he's like, I'd like you to be my Secretary of Treasury. And at this point, Morris is really far in debt. He actually ends up going to debtor's prison later. And Morris is like, I really don't think I'm the best man for the job. What about Hamilton? And Washington's like, well, I didn't really know that Hamilton knew anything about finance. And Morris makes a very famous statement saying, to a mind like his, nothing is amiss. Basically saying, like, to a mind like Hamilton's, he can figure anything out. And that kind of leads it to look like Washington didn't know that Hamilton could do that, which I'm sure he did, because Hamilton had been one of his closest advisors and aide-de-camps throughout the war. So he then appoints Hamilton as Secretary of Treasury, which in hindsight was a very good move on Washington's part, because Hamilton eventually does create the groundwork for the financial system that we still use in the United States today. It's withstood the test of time. The next person he chooses is Thomas Jefferson for Secretary of State. And Secretary of State is the cabinet that handles foreign affairs. And Jefferson really is the perfect person for this, because throughout the Revolutionary era, you've really got three people that deal with foreign affairs. The first one is Benjamin Franklin. Franklin had lived in Great Britain for a while. He had been ambassador to France for several years. it's not until his wife dies that he comes back to the United States even. He'd spent many years abroad. And of course, when he comes back, he signs the Declaration and all that. But he was influential in getting the French in on our side during the war and was very well known as a foreign diplomat. But by this point, 1789, he's the oldest of the founding fathers, and he's in his 80s, so he wouldn't be the best person for Secretary of State. The next person would be John Adams. Adams, during the war, had gone over to France with his young son, John Quincy Adams, two future presidents, and he also was influential in convincing the French to gain the wherewithal to join us in the war and back us. But John Adams is now vice president, so he can't be Secretary of State. And so the third option would be Thomas Jefferson, who also spent much of the war over in France and became very good friends with many of the French diplomats. And so he had an established relationship, so he was a good person for that. And then the last one is Edmund Randolph. He becomes Attorney General, and this is a man who had been governor of Virginia and was also an attorney for a really long time. And so he's a good person for Attorney General because that's the person in the cabinet that handles the court systems. And so because he'd been an attorney, because he'd been a governor, he has the law knowledge that is required for such a position. Hamilton becomes Secretary of Treasury, and this deals with all issues involving money or taxes. So he actually ends up with the largest department within the cabinet, because not only is he setting up the financial system for the country, but he's responsible for collecting taxes, collecting revenue on imports and exports. And so he also creates a set of revenue cutters that will go out and prevent smuggling into the country, because there's a lot of smugglers out there that are trying to bring goods from other countries into the United States without having to pay the taxes that are required to do so. And so Hamilton sets up these revenue cutters that ends up becoming the Coast Guard. And then you got Thomas Jefferson over here, Secretary of State, dealing with issues involving foreign nations. So we got to create these friendships between, our former enemies if we're going to have anything to do, because Great Britain is one of our biggest importer and exporter nations. We trade with them a great deal. And then France obviously helped us in the war. We're friends with them. We need to maintain that friendship. These are Washington's two most influential cabinet members, but they have very different viewpoints on how government should be handled within the United States. Hamilton is a Federalist. He's very pro-strong central government. He believes in a loose interpretation of the Constitution. He wants a national bank to help with the country's economy. He's very pro-industry, so he wants an economy that's based largely on shipping and manufacturing. He's pro-assumption of states' debts, and he supports the, I guess you could say, the elite, the merchants, the manufacturers, the large landowners, whereas Jefferson's an anti-federalist. He's anti-large federal government. He's very much a states' rights man. He believes that it should be a laissez-faire government or a limited government. He's afraid of the president getting too powerful and becoming a monarch. We just broke away from that, so he has a right to be afraid. He also believes in a very strict interpretation of the Constitution. If the Constitution doesn't specifically say the federal government can do it, then it should be left to the states to decide. He wants an economy based on farming, which is very characteristic of Jefferson because even though he is very much an elite within the nation, he's a farmer. He owns a very large plantation at Monticello in Virginia, and he believes in, I guess, the middling people, or the plain people, the tradesmen, the farmers, the common man. Hamilton believes a strong national government is necessary to provide order. We can't have every state making their own laws because then we're not really united. And by governmental definition, a state is a country. So essentially what we've created here is multiple countries under one overarching government. And Hamilton believes that that overarching government needs to be strong in order to provide guidance to those other smaller countries, so to speak. He wants to build a strong economy, both focused on industry and self-sufficiency. So what that means is we need to be able to take care of ourselves through our own economy, and the way to do that is by manufacturing. We can manufacture goods. We can then sell those goods not only within our own nation, but overseas to our trading partners, Great Britain, France, Spain, things like that. And he believes the Constitution should be loosely interpreted to allow the growing government to respond to issues that may arise. Hamilton understands that the Founding Fathers can't foresee the issues that are going to happen within the nation. And so if you have a loose interpretation of the Constitution, then you can roll with the punches, so to speak, and adapt the Constitution to whatever issues may arise down the road, which is pretty brilliant because back then nobody's going to have any idea about LGBT rights or abortion issues or civil rights. Civil rights wasn't really focused upon back then. But these are all the different things that the Constitution has to interpret and figure out now. Jefferson believes political power should remain with the states' governments in order to protect liberty. The states know more what their people need than the federal government. For example, with this thought process, the state government down in Austin is going to have a better understanding of what the people in Texas need than, people on Capitol Hill thousands of miles away in Washington. And he believes that the people will be better taken care of if the states have more political power. He also wants the economy to remain focused on farming, and he wants the government to protect those farmers. And this is a very Southern way of thinking as we move forward, because as we move forward into the 19th century, or out of the 19th century, into the 20th century, we're going to see the North growing more and more agrarian, the North growing more and more industrial, and the South growing more and more agrarian. We're going to see that leading up to the Civil War in the 19th century, and even into the 20th century with the boom in industry and factories in the North and the less industrial might in the South until World War II in the 1940s. And he also believes the Constitution should be strictly interpreted. And this goes back to his states' rights ideas, because if the Constitution is strictly interpreted, then it only gives a few powers to the federal government. Anything that's not explicitly said in the Constitution that should be handled by the federal government then in turn gets handled by the state governments, and that would be good. Among their biggest disagreement was Hamilton's financial plan. And in 1789, Hamilton proposes this multi-page giant document that would provide a guide for the future U.S. economy. The first thing he does is he proposes funding an assumption of all state debts occurred during the Revolutionary War. So each state had its own debt from the war, paying its soldiers, paying its militias, things like that. So he believes that the federal government should take on that debt, and in turn, that would allow the government to force the states to work together. And by repaying all of that debt, the U.S. would then in turn gain foreign credit. And it's really genius, because by the time we get out of the 18th century into the 19th century, the United States debt in comparison, our credit rating, so to speak, is as low as any of the other major countries in the world. And so it works. Thomas Jefferson's very anti this. He's like, Virginia's already paid off our debt, so you're not going to get me with this. Like, my debt's paid off. But it gets approved by Washington, and so the funding is there. The assumption of states' debt is there. And at this point, looking at how much debt we were in, we owe $77,228,000, and it's about $4,269,000 to run the country. So our debt is almost $81.5 million at this point. And the total income that we've received, because remember, the war's over in 1781. Well, 1783, really, because that's when the treaty is official. And from then until Hamilton's plan is approved, we're not really getting any revenue. We're not getting that much revenue. Between 1789 and 1791, we only generate about $4.5 million worth of revenue, because under the Articles we can't tax. Only the states can tax. So we're not getting any money there. And even after the Constitution goes into play in 1789, we're still not generating that much money. So we're $81 million in debt, but we're only bringing in about $4 million. So we need financial help. And Hamilton's plan makes sense. So it's passed. The second thing he wants to do to raise money for the new nation, because we got to pay off that $81 million in debt, a tax on whiskey, because at this point in time, pretty much everybody drinks whiskey. So that's a good way to raise money, is to put an extra tax on it, so that when people buy it, they're paying a little bit extra, and that tax then goes into the revenue for the country to pay off the debt. And he also wants to create a protective tariff on foreign manufactured goods. So a protective tariff would be an extra tax. And so he means to promote American-made goods. So if you can get a roll of cloth at $4 a roll in the United States, that same roll of cloth would cost $4 from Great Britain as well. But if you put a 25% tariff on it, that British-made cloth now costs $5 as opposed to the $4 that you could get for American-made cloth. So Hamilton's thought process is Americans are going to start buying American-made goods as opposed to British-made goods. And if they do buy British-made goods, that's more money in our pocket. Congress in Washington do approve the whiskey tax, but they do not approve the protective tariff. They think that's going a little bit too far. Hamilton also proposes creating a Bank of the United States, and the purpose of this would be to regulate the money supply. Because under the Articles of Confederation, there's no national currency. So it's difficult because you have to basically exchange your money when you go across state lines. And that's not really productive. And so this would regulate a money supply. We'd have a national currency, and it would hold funds and loan to state banks. So this would make the financial system a little bit stronger in the federal government. Jefferson argues the Bank of the U.S. is unconstitutional because it gives too much power to bankers in the cities. And remember, he's very strict interpretation of the Constitution, and the Constitution does not specifically say you can create a Bank of the United States. So therefore, Jefferson believes, that it should be relegated to the states. President Washington agrees with Hamilton. So Congress does pass a law creating the Bank of the U.S. in 1791, and Hamilton argues that the Bank of the U.S. falls under the necessary and proper clause of the Constitution that basically says as long as a law is required for bettering of the nation, so to speak, then it can be passed. And so that's his argument back to Jefferson. Well, it falls under necessary and proper to control the economy and regulate currency, so therefore it is necessary and we can do it. The disagreements between Hamilton and Jefferson lead to the formation of our first political parties. Hamilton forms the Federalist Party. He supports strong national governments, loose interpretation of the Constitution, strong financial system favoring banks and industry, and supports England when war breaks out with France. And this is key because we had promised France that we would help them out if they ever went to war with Great Britain. But Great Britain is one of our biggest trading partners. And so the financial mind that is Hamilton is looking at it as, if we support France, we're going to lose our largest trading partner, and then we're going to lose money, and that would be bad. Jefferson forms the Democratic Republican Party. So from being an anti-federalist, he just creates the Democratic Republicans. They still believe the same as an anti-federalist, anti-big government. They believe in strong state governments, strict interpretation of the Constitution, state banks and policies that support the small farmers, and supporting France when war breaks out with England. Now remember, Jefferson has a very strong relationship with France because he had been the ambassador there for years. And he remembers when they didn't ask for money, they didn't ask for land, they didn't ask for anything other than, if we are to go to war in the future with Great Britain, you're going to come in and help us like we came in and helped you. At this point, though, there's not a king. There's actually no ruler in France. And that's Hamilton's argument. He's like, yeah, we promised a king, but the king has now been killed. So who are we pledging to help? There's no government. They're in anarchy. So after 4 years, Washington is unanimously elected president for a second term. And so his second term is 1793 to 1797. And Washington had to solve some really bad problems that are arising after his first term. In 1793, war breaks out between Britain and France after the French Revolution. And France tries to gain an alliance with us because they remember, like, hey, you promised if we came in and helped you, you'd have our back. Jefferson wants to help France and support their fight for liberty. It's like, hey, they did it for us. They did it for us, so we should hold to that promise. And Hamilton wants to support Britain because he doesn't want to make our biggest trading partner mad, because then we would lose money, and that's kind of his job, is to make sure that money is coming in. And so in the musical Hamilton, they do a really great job of representing this as like a modern rap battle, because that's really what the argument over it was in our modern context. So let's see what they have to say.
The issue on the table, France is on the verge of war with England. Do we commit money and aid to our French allies, or do we stay out of it? Remember, my decision on this matter is not subject to congressional approval. The only one you have to convince is me. Secretary Jefferson, you have the floor, sir.
When we were on death's door, when we were needy, we made a promise. We signed a treaty. We needed money and guns and half a chance. Who provided those funds?
France.
In return, they didn't ask for land. Only a promise that we'd lend a hand and stand with them if they fought against oppressors. And revolution is messy, but now is the time to stand. Stand with our brothers as they fight against tyranny. I know that Alexander Hamilton is here and he would rather not have this debate. I'll remind you that he is not Secretary of State. He knows nothing of loyalty. Smells like new money, dresses like fake royalty. Desperate to rise above his station. Everything he does betrays the ideals of our nation. Hey, and if you don't know, now you know, Mr. President.
Thank you, Secretary Jefferson. Secretary Hamilton, your response.
Come on, hey, what? Say something.
You must be out of your goddamn mind if you think the president is gonna bring the nation to the brink of meddling in the middle of a military mess, a game of chess where France is queen and kingless. We signed a treaty with the king whose head is now in a basket. Would you like to take it out and ask it? Or should we honor a treaty, King Louis's head? Do whatever you want, I'm super dead. It's too fragile to start another fight.
Sir, do we not fight for freedom?
Sure, when the French figure out who's gonna lead them,
The people are leading.
the people are rioting. There's a difference. Frankly, it's a little disquieting. You would let your ideals blind you to reality. Hamilton, sir, draft a statement of neutrality.
Did you forget Lafayette?
What?
Have you an ounce of regret? You accumulate debt, you accumulate power, yet in that hour of need you forget.
Lafayette's a smart man, he'll be fine. And before he was your friend, he was mine. If we try to fight in every revolution in the world, we never stop. Where do we draw the line?
So quick-witted.
Alas, I admit it.
I bet you were quite a lawyer.
What defendant's gotta quit it?
Yeah. Well, someone ought to remind you.
What?
You're nothing without Washington behind you.
Hamilton.
Daddy's calling.
So in 1793, Washington made a very important foreign policy precedent with the Proclamation of Neutrality. And in this proclamation, Washington states that the duty and interest of the United States require that the United States should with sincerity and good faith adopt and pursue a conduct friendly and impartial towards the belligerent powers being those that are at war. And it warns Americans that the federal government should prosecute any violations of its policy by the citizens and would not protect them if they were tried by a belligerent nation. Meaning if they ended up going and fighting on one side and then getting caught by the other and being brought up on charges, then the U.S. wouldn't help them. And it triggered a pretty fierce reaction from people who considered it a sellout if the nation's revolutionary soul for financial gain of the merchant class. And there were several important developments in both American and Europe ideas that led to his Neutrality Proclamation. The first one being the French Revolution turned more radical when it beheaded the king. And then revolutionary France, already fighting Austria and Prussia, declares war on England and also Holland and Spain, basically threw the entire European continent into war. And then later, French minister Edmond Guénée arrives in Charleston, and he was an instant hit with American people who flocked in large numbers to meet him. And he was basically here to actively recruit revolutionary patriots to the French cause. And all of this was really seen as overstepping Americans' bounds. We're this brand new, tiny little country. We don't have the military force. We don't have the money. we don't have any of this stuff to really help you out. And so the Proclamation of Neutrality is basically saying, we're not doing it. And Congress remedied the situation of the proclamation's legal limbo by passing the Neutrality Act, which gives the president the policy to enforce the law. And it really basically says, we're not getting involved. In 1794, Washington faced another really big crisis, which was the Whiskey Rebellion. Hamilton's whiskey tax had really frustrated Western farmers in Pennsylvania, who saw it as the elite unfairly taxing the poor. And when Shays' Rebellion had broken out in 1787, the weak government under the Articles couldn't stop them. And so when the Whiskey Rebellion breaks out, Washington saw the uprising as a threat to public safety in the nation. And so he mobilizes an army of 13,000 soldiers to go in and shut this rebellion down as a means of protecting the public. The quick end to the rebellion reveals the strength of the new national government under the Constitution, because also under the Articles, the federal government does not have the power to raise an army, but under the Constitution, they do. And so they quickly put an end to the Whiskey Rebellion, and it shows the power of this new federal government. In 1796, Washington chooses to not run for a third term, although he could have, because at that point in time, there is no constitutional guideline for how long a president can serve. And he is afraid that if he dies in office, it's going to create a precedent that presidents can serve for life. And he doesn't want that because he knows his people are already fearful of a monarchy. And so he's like, okay, I've served 2 terms. Really, he'd served like 40 years of his life as a major leader of the nation. And so he just wants to go home. He wants to go hang out on his plantation and live out the rest of his life peacefully. And so when he was thinking about whether he was going to run for a second term, he had James Madison draft a farewell address. But then he decided to take on a second term, so that was kind of thrown to the side. But in 1796, he asks Hamilton to help him out, and they draft a farewell address. And in this address, he basically gives advice to the nation on his departure. He warns of growing factions and political parties. Washington was very against political parties because he felt like it was just going to create a divide within the country. He also warns about growing sectional tensions between North and South. And this kind of foreshadows the Civil War a little bit. He's basically saying, like, you gotta work together. In order for this nation to be successful and for it to be strong, North and South must work together. And he restates his desire for neutrality by warning against entangling alliances. He basically says that, we're just gaining our own footing. We don't have the strength, we don't have the power to be able to do this on our own. So let's focus on ourselves. And maybe when we get bigger, maybe then we can form alliances or friendships. After Washington's retirement, he goes back to Mount Vernon, and under his administration, they also had decided on where to put the nation's capital. So it starts in New York, and then they decide, as a means of getting Hamilton's financial plan passed, they decide, okay, like Hamilton, the financial situation can stay in in New York, and they're going to move the capital eventually. They're going to remove to Washington, which they decided to build on the Potomac River. And so it's going to stay in New York, and then it's going to move to Philadelphia for 10 years, and then eventually it will remove to Washington once it's built. And so after Washington's retirement, the Democratic, Republicans, and the Federalists campaigned for presidency in 1796. The Federalist is John Adams, who had been the vice president, and Thomas Jefferson had stepped down as Secretary of State, so he could run for president as well. And he runs on the Democratic-Republican ticket. And a lot of people are like, well, how is this short, cranky Yankee gonna defeat this tall, glamorous, famous Thomas Jefferson? But he does. And it's pretty close. It's a 49% to 51% electoral vote, but Adams does come out the winner in the end. And the war between England and France is still going on, and it continues to cause issues for the United States into the Adams administration. France was really frustrated with American neutrality, and so in order to show their anger, they start seizing merchant ships. So if a U.S. ship is going over to trade goods with Great Britain, French pirates would seize the ship and take the sailors. And so Adams sends diplomats to France to help negotiate an agreement and kind of avoids this quasi-war with France. And they come up with an agreement with the United States being allowed to have trade rights in Europe. So this stops this issue. And then 3 French officials, not named by name in documents, so they nickname them X, Y, and Z. They demand a bribe to meet with French ministers. And Americans are very offended. They're like, why? This is not okay. You can't bribe us. And so this is significant because it leads to an undeclared war on the United States. And we don't actually fight with them. But because of the XYZ affair, and because the American diplomats refuse to pay money to meet with the French foreign minister, Congress chooses to increase defenses. And so the Department of the Navy and the warships are created to defend us on the water. And so the XYZ affair ends up being part of this quasi-war. And the quasi-war ends when Napoleon takes control of France. And at the Convention of 1800, France and the U.S. finally sign the Treaty of Mortefontaine and ends the war officially, because you have to have a treaty to end a war. President Adams's handling of the conflict with France led to criticisms by the Democratic Republicans because, of course, they're led by Thomas Jefferson, and Jefferson's very pro-France. And so Federalists in Congress passed the Alien and Sedition Acts. And this law makes it a crime to criticize government leaders. They restricted citizenship for new immigrants and made deporting immigrants easier. And part of this was because Adams was just a really paranoid guy. He didn't like people to talk ugly about him. And the Americans see this attack on free speech and citizenship as an attack on them themselves. And it backfires. And it really badly damages Adams' reputation and the reputation of the Federalist Party itself. So Republicans Jefferson and Madison write the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions to attack the Federalist Party, and these essays present an argument for states' rights, suggesting the states could ignore or nullify unfair national laws. So you believe that the Alien and Sedition Acts are unfair to you? Cool. Ignore them. You don't have to abide by them. And the arguments of states' rights and nullification will be used later in the South when the idea of secession comes about in 1861, leading to the beginning of the Civil War. And so if you look back at the founding era, it really does set up some of the guidelines or the precedents that end up leading to the American Civil War. And so Adams and his Federalist Party were really unpopular by the election of 1800, and Republican Jefferson defeats him in the election of 1800. Now, Jefferson had been his vice president, because at this point in time, the guy who comes in second place is the guy who gets to be vice president. And so Adams is beat by his own vice president, and the election of 1800 marks the first time in American history when political party power is transferred from one to the other. So we are now moving from the Federalist Party to the Democratic Republican Party. And Jefferson's victory over Adams marks the beginning of a 30-year Democratic Republican dominance in the White House. And by this time, the White House is partially built. We have removed to Washington. The Adamses lived there from November to March. So November of 1799 to November of 1800 to March of 1801 when Jefferson takes over. And this is 30 years. In the first 30 years of the 19th century is dominated by Democratic Republicans. And we'll talk about that more in depth as we move through the 19th century. Thank you for listening, and I hope you have a great day.